Well, thank you very much. Thanks to Sarah and the organizing committee for the invitation to speak today. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share a bit of my story with you. As I was preparing for today's talk, a line from the classic Talking Heads song, Once in a Lifetime, got stuck in my head, although my earworm had a slight variation from the original. And you may find yourself speaking to a room full of gun lawyers, and you may ask yourself, well, how did I get here? I never saw, touched, or fired a gun until I was 42 years old. 8 years later, here I am speaking to the National Firearms Law Seminar. That amazes me. So without disrupting your hard-earned lunch too much, I want to share with you my story, the story of how a liberal professor became an armed American. I'll also share with you some of what I have learned as a sociologist over the past half dozen years I have spent studying American gun culture. To begin, I don't want to assume you have any in-depth knowledge of what sociologists do, so let me highlight two common responses to the question of what is sociology. In the first place, the painful elaboration of the obvious, and secondly, common sense made difficult. So many people think that sociologists just tell us what we already know about the world in a much more tortured language. But as we know from efforts to promote common sense gun laws, one person's common sense is another person's nonsense. So there may be things about gun culture today that you, as people heavily involved in that culture, take for granted that are a revelation to people like me who come from outside that culture. This is why Peter Berger wrote decades ago that the first wisdom of sociology is this: things are not what they seem. As a liberal professor journeying into American gun culture, I've been continually surprised at what I have found, how things are very much not what they seem from the outside. So despite the occasional bad press, I still believe in the promise of sociology to illuminate realities like guns and gun culture in our society. According to the great sociologist of the mid-20th century, C. Wright Mills, the sociological imagination allows us to grasp what is going on in the world and to understand what is going on in ourselves as minute points of the intersections of biography and history within society. And as I hope you'll see, a sociological imagination guides my approach to answering the question posed by the talking heads: how did I get here? Now, knowing what I know now about the ubiquity of gun culture in America, I find it remarkable that I avoided guns for as long as I did in my life. But the orthodox liberalism of my social environment certainly helped. I grew up in a little town called Half Moon Bay in the San Francisco Bay Area. And in this land of unicorns and rainbows, I played sports, I revered Dr. Martin Luther King, and I protested against apartheid in South Africa. I don't ever recall seriously talking about guns, either positively or negatively, growing up. But if someone had asked my opinion as an Orthodox liberal, I would have said nothing much good comes from guns, so the fewer the better. After graduating from high school in 1986, I left California for Washington, D.C., where I enrolled in American University, served as president of the College Democrats there, and hosted a McLaughlin Group-style political roundtable on the campus TV station. Our big concern at the time was global nuclear annihilation, and so we didn't have much interest in the small arms of American gun culture. Disillusioned with politics, after just 2 years, I left Washington and retreated into the ivory tower. I made my way back to California, where I enrolled at UC Berkeley and got my undergraduate degree. And I entered the discipline of sociology, where I've spent the past 30 years as a student and professor. But even when I left California for parts of the country that are more flush with guns and gun culture, like Wisconsin and Indiana, I remained insulated from gun culture by my liberal academic bubble. In graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, I lived in Madison, which, as you know, is known as the Berkeley of the Midwest. And in Indiana, for my first faculty job at the University of Notre Dame, I remained safely protected from thoughts of guns by my fellow card-carrying liberal academics. In 2005, I moved to Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and the liberal academic bubble insulating me from guns began to break down. I have to give a lot of credit for this to my wife, Sandy, who's a native North Carolinian. In fact, she grew up in the next town over, the next county over from Winston-Salem in a town called Mocksville. Now, Mocksville has the distinction of being named the #1 most redneck city in the state of North Carolina. And one of the key criteria for this distinction is the number of gun stores per capita. And Davy Outfitters, which is pictured here in the story, I've actually bought 2 or 3 guns from myself. So not only were guns a normal part of life for Sandy growing up in Mocksville, she also served in the United States Coast Guard and qualified as an expert with the Beretta M9 that she carried when she was performing her law enforcement duties. One moment early in our relationship highlights how far apart we were in our experience of gun culture. We were driving down the highway between Winston-Salem and Mocksville one afternoon, and I looked out into a cornfield, and I saw a wooden structure that seemed very out of place. I said, "Sandy, isn't that a weird spot for some kids to build a fort?" She looked at me as if I was from another planet, which I actually sort of was, and said, "Well, that's a deer stand." And she further had to explain to me what a deer stand is used for. And for some reason, she married me anyway. Of course, in North Carolina, guns are not just limited to rednecks like Sandy. The whole state is lousy with gun culture. I actually met Sandy through tennis, and conversations with other white-collar professionals I played tennis with reinforced what I learned from Sandy. So my buddy who worked in healthcare marketing had several long guns that had been in his family for generations. My other buddy who worked in IT had 2 .40 caliber pistols, a Glock and a Smith & Wesson. My mixed doubles teammate, a real estate agent, carried a gun when she showed houses. So talking to these friends, I began to feel like I was the only person in North Carolina who didn't have a gun. And this was an important first lesson I learned in my journey into gun culture. Guns are normal, and normal people use guns. This idea became the foundation for all of my scholarly work on American gun culture, as I made clear in a programmatic statement I published in 2017 called The Sociology of U.S. Gun Culture. I believe the organizers have provided you with a link to that article if you'd like to see it. Although I'm not the first scholar studying guns who has begun with this premise or come to this conclusion, the idea has yet to catch on in academia. A quarter century ago, in 1995, sociologist James Wright included among his 10 essential observations on guns in America that gun ownership is normative, not deviant behavior across vast swaths of the social landscape. The idea that guns are normal and normal people use guns may seem common sense to those of us gathered here, but it's actually a dramatic departure from the standard social scientific approaches that view guns and gun owners as deviant, and research literatures that are dominated by criminological and epidemiological studies of gun violence. This theme is so constant that the New York Times ran a headline just last week declaring, "Gun research is suddenly hot." In fact, the story was about how research on gun violence is suddenly hot. Research on the lawful use of guns is as cold as ever. I'm in the academic equivalent of Siberia. And to quote the talking heads once again, same as it ever was, same as it ever was. Now when the media, especially the foreign media, call me for insight into American gun culture, I like to have a single, simple statistic for them that highlights the normality of guns here. One I've been using recently comes from the 2017 survey of guns by the Pew Research Center. And I was fortunate to be able to consult on the design of that survey before they fielded it, and they asked many good questions, which of course I mean questions that I suggested they ask. Now, one good question they asked that I didn't think to ask was, regardless of whether or not you own a gun, have you ever fired a gun? And Pew found that 72% of respondents said yes. That is nearly 3/4 of all respondents. And extrapolated to the US adult population, that means that upwards of 180 million American adults have fired a gun before. If that's not a normal behavior in our society, I don't know what is. So for all the criticism we hear of the mainstream media, however, the media actually played an important role in my conversion to gun culture. Even before I started talking to Sandy about guns, I made an important discovery in a hotel room at the Country Inn & Suites in Columbus, Georgia. I was there for a tennis tournament with my son, and between his matches, I was flipping through channels on the TV. And by dumb luck, I landed on a History Channel marathon showing back-to-back episodes of the inaugural season of Top Shot. I didn't have cable TV at the time, so the idea that a mainstream channel would air a program that combined the basic premise of the reality TV show Survivor with a shooting gallery on steroids captured by high-speed videography was a revelation to me. And to this day, I remember the trick shot showdown in episode 7 of that first season. Tara Poremba hit all of her targets shooting a Winchester Model 1873 rifle, Annie Oakley style, over her shoulder backwards using a mirror to aim. And Chris Serino drove 2 of 3 nails by hitting them on the head with bullets fired from a Smith & Wesson double-action revolver. I didn't realize it at the time, but the excitement of watching the marksmanship skills of these Top Shot contestants planted in me a seed of interest in firearms. So getting interested in firearms because of Top Shot and sensitized to their normality by my developing relationship with Sandy inspired me to overcome my long-standing fear of guns by learning how they work. Sandy paved the way for this by calling her high school classmate from Mocksville, Jimmy Staley, who's a gun trainer for the North Carolina Highway Patrol, and Jimmy invited us to his farm for a shooting lesson. He loaded a magazine with 9mm cartridges, inserted the magazine into his 6-hour P226, and handed the gun to me. He showed me how to grip the pistol and said, "Go ahead." In January of 2011, as a 42-year-old, I shot a real gun for the first time. It mattered. It definitely mattered. Unfortunately, we didn't take any photos that day. It was supposed to be a one-time experience to show me how guns work and so that I could say that I did it. And anxiety also wiped clean my memory of the precise moment when I pulled the trigger for the first time. But what I do remember is that I missed the target completely. As I shot my way through the first magazine, Jimmy suggested adjustments to my grip and stance and sight alignment and trigger press, and I walked each consecutive shot in closer to the bullseye. At the end of the session, Jimmy said, "You did all right." Expecting to be frightened, instead I felt challenged. The experience was not unlike golfing. Golfers among us know that you can have fun golfing even if you are not a good golfer. And getting better at golf, or even just making a couple of good shots in an entire round, is enough to bring you back. Getting into guns was most assuredly not my intention that day, but after shooting fewer than 50 rounds, I was hooked. Which is the second lesson I learned in my journey into gun culture. Shooting is fun and challenging. It's fun in part because it is challenging. In these trying political times, this very attractive aspect of gun culture too often gets lost. So the first lesson I learned in my process of conversion to guns is that guns are normal and normal people use guns. And the second lesson I learned is that shooting is fun and challenging. But at this point, you may be asking yourself, what does gun culture 2.0 have to do with it? To begin to answer this question, I have to recall an event that took place between my discovery of Top Shot and getting to know Sandy and other gun nuts in my social network. In the spring of 2010, I was living in an apartment in Winston-Salem. I hadn't lived in an apartment for 20 years since I was in college. Fortunately, I could afford to live in one of the better apartment complexes in Winston-Salem, but even in a nice apartment complex, you have vacancies and turnover, and this transiency means you don't always get to know your neighbors as well as you could or perhaps should. So in 3 years I lived in Brierley Park Apartments. There were at least 4 tenants in the apartment above mine, and I never had a conversation with any of them, or really anybody else in the complex, beyond just saying, how's it going? The sole exception was a woman in her mid-40s who lived alone in an upstairs unit on the back side of my building. Over a few months' time, through conversations in the parking lot, we got to know each other a little bit better. We'd talk about work or the weather. I'd say we were apartment neighborly. We knew each other well enough to chat, but I didn't ever even learn her name. One Saturday afternoon in October 2010, I was just getting home with my 2 younger kids when I noticed my neighbor distressed and arguing with a man I didn't recognize. She was standing in the open driver's side door of her car, blocking him from getting in and pleading with him not to take it. He was standing very close to her and yelling at her to just get back in the damn apartment. I was nervous, but I felt I should try to help my neighbor, so I stepped over to ask her if everything was okay. The man looked at me, menacingly, I would say, and said he was her boyfriend. And he added with emphasis, just mind your own damn business. It was clear that it was a threat and not a suggestion. I told him I had my kids with me and I didn't want any trouble, and I asked her again if everything was okay. He backed away from her, and she said yes. They went to her apartment, and I and my kids went to mine. The next day, a frantic knocking on my apartment door startled us all. I looked through the peephole and saw my neighbor. She had a panicked expression on her face, and although it was afternoon, she looked like she had just woken up. Just like the day before, I felt uneasy, looking at the trouble outside my door. But once again, my instinct to help kicked in. I hurried my kids into one of the bedrooms and shut the door. As they hid in the bedroom closet, I let my neighbor in. She told me through tears that the guy she was with the day before had threatened to kill her with a knife and stolen her cell phone and car. Thinking again of my kids, I hurried her outside where I allowed her to use my phone to call first her father and then the police. And about a half an hour later, the police arrived to take a report for the crime of unauthorized use of conveyance. The incident report I found online later said that drugs or alcohol use was involved. The offender and victim were related to each other as boyfriend, girlfriend, and the case was closed due to the refusal of the victim to cooperate. This experience opened my eyes to the reality that no one is immune from violence. I also confronted the reality that my impulse to be a good Samaritan to my neighbor endangered not only me, but more significantly, my children. And not just in that moment, but going forward as well. I realized that I had no means of protecting us if my neighbor's boyfriend/drug dealer decided to seek retaliation for my involvement in reporting him to the police. I felt deeply the meaning of a gun culture cliche I would hear often in the ensuing years. When seconds count, police are just minutes away. This feeling of insecurity and desire to protect my family and myself played a major role in changing me from an orthodox liberal who had no use for guns into an American who is armed not just with a Ruger 10/22 for plinking or a CZ over-under shotgun to shoot sporting clays, but an American who is armed with a subcompact pistol and a North Carolina concealed handgun permit. But as a sociologist, I know that my decision to buy and carry a gun was not made in a vacuum. It was influenced by people in my social network, like Sandy and my tennis buddies. It was affected by the positive portrayal of guns I saw in Top Shot. And more generally, it was facilitated by living in a particular historical and social context that was conducive to armed self-defense. Men make their own history, Karl Marx famously wrote, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances already given and transmitted from the past. Had I been living in my childhood home of Half Moon Bay instead of Winston-Salem, it's unlikely that I would have sought an armed response to my problem of insecurity, at least not as quickly as I did. The same is true had I been living in Winston-Salem in the first 3/4 of the 20th century, before the shall issue revolution in concealed carry swept over the country. Put simply, I was not simply getting into guns as an individual, I was becoming enmeshed in a long-standing culture of guns in American society. But the gun culture I was entering was not the same as the gun culture of the 1850s, much less the 1950s. In an influential essay called America as a Gun Culture, the historian Richard Hofstadter lamented the uniqueness of the United States as the only modern industrial urban nation that persists in maintaining a gun culture. In Hofstadter's account, American gun culture is rooted in the widespread lawful possession of firearms by a large segment of the population. And this culture stretches back to before the nation's founding, but as the country developed, so too did our gun culture. What began as a necessity of agriculture in the frontier, Hofstadter observed, took hold as a sport and as an ingredient in the American imagination. Hunting became not only a source of food, but a dominant form of recreation for many, and target shooting, both recreational and competitive, was commonplace in the 19th century. In the early 20th century, gun collecting arose as an avocation among the wealthy, but like other forms of collecting, it took on a more democratized form by the mid-century. And today, Americans own guns for many reasons, including hunting, sport, and collecting. My own experience shows that fun is an important point of entry into gun culture and reason for remaining in it. That said, the center of gravity of American gun culture has shifted over the past half-century. The majority of gun owners in 21st century America, especially new gun owners like me, point to self-defense as the primary reason for owning a gun. A 1999 poll found that 26% of respondents cited protection as the primary reason for owning a gun, and by 2013 that proportion had grown to 48%. Hunting, sport shooting, and gun collecting declined by roughly equal amounts. More recently, the Pew Research Center found that 67% of respondents cited protection as a major reason for owning a firearm. And forced to choose, 52% of respondents say it's the primary reason, as compared to just 20% who cite hunting and 10% who cite collecting as the primary reason for owning guns. Another way of measuring this change in the center of gravity in American gun culture is by looking at themes in gun advertising over time. To this end, with my son and another Wake Forest undergraduate, we analyzed advertisements in the American Rifleman from 1918 to 2017. The findings graphically depict a profound change. As you can see in this figure, over this 100-year period, the prevalence of hunting and recreational shooting themes in ads, represented by the red line, declined in an almost mirror image to the increase in personal protection and concealed carry themes, represented by the green line. These changes in American gun culture both fostered and were fostered by the liberalization of concealed carry laws that began in the 1980s. Even before the first wave of shall-issue laws had finished washing over the country, a second wave of permitless carry laws began and has picked up steam in just the past few years. The spread of this concealed carry revolution is strikingly evident in this GIF from the Wikipedia page on the history of concealed carry. And here the blue represents shall-issue laws, and the green represents permitless carry laws. Not long after my experience shooting on Jimmy's range, I came across Michael Bain's Downrange Radio podcast. In a post-SHOT Show episode covering new trends for 2011, Bain distinguished between what he called gun culture 1.0 and gun culture 2.0. Gun culture 1.0, according to Bain, is the historic culture of guns in America that Hofstadter described. And gun culture 2.0 is the new culture of armed citizenship I was just entering. Hearing Bain again made me realize that what I thought was my unique personal experience of getting into guns was actually a more common experience of becoming part of a social and historical movement happening in American gun culture. Now, there's a lot I could say about gun culture 2.0 after half a dozen years of concerted study. I could talk about, for example, the guns and gear that are the central technologies of concealed carry by armed citizens, something I've actually published a book chapter about. The rise and development of the civilian gun training industry, risk management and self-defense insurance, among other things. But when I was trying to think of the single most important lesson I learned in my journey into gun culture 2.0, what kept coming to mind was this. Gun culture 2.0 is inclusive, or at least has the potential to be inclusive, because self-defense is a universal concern. Of course, we know from many surveys over a long period of time that the statistically average legal gun owner is a politically conservative, middle-aged, married man from a rural area in the South or the Mountain West. Basically, the guys from Duck Dynasty. Compared to gun culture 1.0, however, gun culture 2.0 is younger and more female, more racially and sexually diverse, more urban and suburban, and more attracted to handguns for self-defense. So as noted earlier, the majority of all gun owners cite protection as a reason for ownership. But among those who own handguns, 80% cite protection as a reason. And people who own only handguns, therefore, are central to gun culture 2.0. The 2015 National Firearms Survey provides some interesting information about differences between gun owners in general and those who only own handguns, this core of gun culture 2.0. So we know, for example, that fewer women own guns than men, but among women who do own guns, they are twice as likely as men to own only handguns. We know a higher percentage of whites own guns than racial minorities, but black gun owners are 3 times as likely, and Hispanic gun owners are twice as likely to only own handguns. Urban and suburban gun owners are far more likely to only own handguns than residents of rural areas. And even liberal gun owners are nearly twice as likely as political conservatives to own only handguns. This is some compelling evidence for the diversity we find when we focus our attention on gun culture 2.0. Another way of exploring the inclusiveness of gun culture 2.0 is to look at people like me who are new gun owners. Again, the 2015 National Firearms Survey compared individuals identified as new gun owners to those who are more long-standing gun owners. And again, the results are very suggestive. According to the survey, about 8 to 12% of all current gun owners are new gun owners within the last 5 years. And we differ in significant ways from long-standing gun owners. So new gun owners are more likely to be female, have young kids, be politically liberal, own only handguns, and own guns for protection. And new gun owners are less likely to be old, white, have grown up with a gun in the home, and own guns for hunting and collecting. These new gun owners represent an important part of the future of gun culture 2.0, or perhaps gun culture 3.0 if they push gun culture in America in yet another new direction. Of course, the inclusivity of gun culture 2.0 is not entirely captured in statistics alone. In my journey so far, I have met an amazing collection of people who burst stereotypes about who and what gun owners are, beginning with my wife, Sandy. I'd like to mention a few by name here to exemplify the diversity of gun culture 2.0 and to publicly acknowledge the individuals who have given me personally a better understanding of guns and professionally a better understanding of gun culture. Of course, some of these people are conservative older white men like Michael Bain himself, Massad Ayoob, Tom Givens, Steve Hendricks. They include younger, bearded, and tattooed teachers and media stars like John Johnston of Citizens Defense Research and Ballistic Radio, and John Correa of Active Self-Protection, who I should thank for making it possible to have this talk recorded today. They include brilliant women writers and shooters like Kathy Jackson, otherwise known as the Cornered Cat, and Tamara Keel, whose byline you'll see in magazines like Shooting Illustrated and Recoil. They include skilled African Americans instructors like Tiffany Johnson, who's out among you somewhere, and Akil Kadir of Citizen Safety Academy. They include Asian American men and women like Chris Chang, very special to me as one of the winners of Top Shot, and Annette Evans, someone who enjoyed shooting and training so much that she's opening a gun range outside of Philadelphia. They include political liberals like Randy Mian of the Liberal Gun Owners and Lara Smith of the Liberal Gun Club. They include LGBT2A activists like Piper Smith of Armed Equality, who is also here somewhere in the back. I could go on, but the point I'm trying to make is that the diversity of gun culture 2.0 is not just a reality, it's one of its strengths. So in conclusion, I'd like to offer 3 brief takeaways, one for each of the 3 lessons I've learned in my journey so far. As you'll recall, lesson 1 was guns are normal and normal people use guns. The takeaway from this is we need to resist the efforts out there to stigmatize guns and gun owners, and we do this best by showing the positive face of gun culture to the world. Smashing TVs with sledgehammers and burning newspapers may solidify the base, but it does nothing to convey to those outside the hardcore of the 2A bubble that gun owners are normal. In counteracting those who wish to stigmatize guns and gun owners, disarm them of their stereotypes by being courteous and respectful, even in the face of hostility. So to quote Annette Evans, who's quoting Tiffany Johnson, and Akil Kadir, who's quoting Tony Simon of the 2A, second is for everyone, meet people at 60%. It's not enough to get up to that middle ground between you and someone else. Put a hand across that line and genuinely try to connect with compassion and humility because it's another human being over there. When we do that, we find true commonalities and similarities. And among these are that gun owners are normal. Lesson 2 was shooting is fun and challenging. And following from this, the second takeaway is to promote the actual act of shooting whenever possible. Create and take advantage of opportunities to introduce people to shooting. You don't have to be a credentialed instructor to do this. Get a gun in people's hands and give them a safe and fun experience. So here you can see a picture of my son with an exchange student from Argentina that he hosted. Our trip to the range was certainly one of the highlights of his experiences in America. The other picture is of me with a Wake Forest University student who's shooting for the first time. For the past 5 years, I've taught a course called Sociology of Guns. At the start of every class, I take the entire class to the gun range. No one's required to shoot, but most do, including many students who have never fired a gun before. Although they're not magically converted into armed Americans, a goal that would be inappropriate for my academic course in any event, The experience of shooting has a profound effect on the students who have never shot before. They often experience the fun and excitement and challenge of shooting, and even when they don't, they have a direct experiential knowledge of why other people might. Finally, lesson 3 was Gun Culture 2.0 is inclusive. The associated takeaway is that we should embrace diversity and inclusivity in gun culture. Build bridges, not walls. As this sentiment makes clear, I didn't stop being a liberal professor just because I became an armed American. I became a card-carrying liberal snowflake gun owner. The demographic present and future of America looks different than the historical core of American gun culture, and I would like to see gun culture represent that diversity. We should embrace inclusivity not for pragmatic purposes to ensure the survival of gun culture, however, but because we know that using guns is normal. We know that shooting is fun, and we know that self-defense is a universal concern. My own journey in gun culture is ongoing, both as an active participant and sociological observer, and I hope one day to finish my book on how a liberal professor can become an armed American as a way of explaining gun culture 2.0, both to those inside and outside the culture. In the meantime, I invite you to keep up with me on one of my blogs, gunculture2.0.com or guncurious.com. Follow me on Twitter or Facebook, or just shoot me an old-fashioned email. Thank you very much.